Welcome to Let's Get Writing. I'm Kathryn Mousseau. Again today I have another incredible author for you to meet and to learn about his path to writing, and his name is Fred Humber, and he wrote this most interesting book that has been very, very popular right across the country, Death at the Harbourview Cafe, and it's a true crime story that took place right here in central Newfoundland in the town of Botwood. Fred, an honor to have you here on the set. Thank you for coming all the way from Spaniards Bay to be here today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate that.
Well, this book has been, actually, the time I spoke with Gary Cranford, he said that this was really moving up the ranks in the crime readers.
Yeah, true crime.
True crime.
Yeah.
And that you were at the top of the list, were you not, in Canada, or getting up there?
Yeah, for 2 months up to December across Canada, the book was rated as the #1 bestseller in the true crime series, which is really threw me right off, but very happy about that. The book was launched officially the 26th of October, and that was my 72nd birthday. And it was a nice way to have a birthday party.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of gone crazy from there. The first edition was 3,000 copies, and halfway through they decided they needed a second printing, and they went for that, and that's gone too. So now there's nothing out in Flanker Press's warehouse of the 5,000 copies. It's all been out there, and so now we're waiting, and it should be within a week that the third edition will be there, so we're pretty excited about that.
Well, congratulations.
Well, thank you.
Because this is your first book.
My first book, yeah.
Authors could only wish for this to happen.
Yeah.
And you've been blessed, but it's been an exceptional story, and no doubt, having read it, a lot of work.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about how this whole, let's call it an adventure, how did this start for you to write this book?
Well, I was involved to some extent back on November 6th, 1958. I was walking up a little lane adjacent to the cafe called Birch Lane. I was taking my first guitar lesson, and it was black and rainy that night. And on the way back from the lesson around 8:30, I stopped by the cafe. It had been closed for 3 or 4 days. Mm-hmm. No lights in the building at all, and rumors going mad. Rumors like Jim being the father, had shot his son, Ken, or some people call him Kim, or that he somehow was killed with a shotgun or whatever. All this stuff going on, and that the son had been cut up and put into a freezer to be disposed of at some later date. The father and son had been in conflict for some time, and so I was terrified. So I ran home and crying as a young 13-year-old would, and I asked Mom about it. So she said, "Get that out of your mind and go on to school now. In the morning, everything will be fine." Well, we were walking out Staff Road on our way to school, which passed on the back of the cafe. All the bunch of guys, we were all going to different schools, denominations, whatever. And we looked down over the hill, and one of the boys said, "Man, look at all the cop cars down there." And we looked down, and sure enough, there were cars everywhere, RCMP cars. And just like that, we heard like a boom, a small boom, and this cloud went up in the sky, mm-hmm. And just like that, it was bang, 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 gunfire going off everywhere. So we were just terrified. And so we ran off down to school, and that was the start of the commencement of the real hostilities and the tragedy that unfolded from there.
And you were there. I mean, growing up in Newfoundland, small community like Botwood, I mean, it's unheard of, or very rare for something like this to happen. But this grew into almost a bigger project for you too, because this involved the Chinese community.
Yes.
And the key players in this were a father and son.
Yes.
As part of that community, the owners of the Harbourfront. He was the owner of the Harbourfront Cafe.
And yes, and the Harbourview Cafe, yes, and he was Botwood's first Chinese citizen, mm-hmm. and he was really the beacon for other Chinese looking for opportunities to come to Central and to come to places like Botwood, because Botwood was a seaport. It wasn't an outport with a one industry town. There were many things going on in Botwood, like the shipping the newsprint and shipping the ore from Buckens, and there were many different things using the port facilities. And Botwood, of course, had been a base during the war, and so there was much infrastructure here and much employment. Not a lot of wealth. The money wasn't big, but a lot of people were working. And in came the Chinese, and they were a strange bunch to us, because they didn't interact with us the way that we interacted with one another. Naturally, we thought there was something wrong with them. It occurred to us that there might be something wrong with us. So anyway, they came in to Botwood, and they opened up magazine stores and grocery stores and convenience shops and things of that nature. And they contributed to our life like you would not believe. I can't even imagine Botwood being without the Chinese community in the day that we grew up. And so into this comes this gunfire and this death and this absolutely horrific event. And so everybody was shocked, like, what is this? You know, I mean, and within a matter of hours, we had the first RCMP officer killed in Newfoundland in the line of duty. He had arrived the 15th of October, and on the 7th of November, that was 5 after midnight into the following day, a gunshot blast tore through a door upstairs, killing him. His name was Terry Hoy, and like I say, he was 21 years old, having just arrived, and now he was dead or in the process of dying, and leaving the RCMP officers who were left to deal with that fallout. Nobody knew what to do. I mean, it was unheard of what had happened, being shot through a door. And so the community sprang to its feet, and people came to help, not only to help the RCMP, because they came to help the RCMP, but they also came to help their friend Jim. Jim was not their enemy. They loved Jim, and the children loved Jim. But still, it was an out of control, wild, adventure, I guess you might call it. It was worse than that. It was a tragedy.
It was a tragedy, yeah.
Absolutely. And you know, the children were watching this in the morning. They were standing on wire fences, looking at what's happening here, because they didn't know the danger. Like, nobody fires guns.
You had tear gas. You had fire. You had the fire chief was shot in the arm trying to put out the fire.
He got shot while trying to climb a ladder to spray water into the cafe, so that his friend Jim Ling, who was the man shooting, would not be killed by the fire. How strange is that, eh?
I know, there are
How
many
strange is that?
Yeah.
And when that bullet tore into him, it wasn't aimed at him. It was just a man out of control. And so he ended up having to be transported out of Botwood by way of an amphibian plane out of Gander, EPA. They flew him then out to St. John's to be rushed, emergency rushed surgery with Dr. Schachter, who became a very famous doctor after that. He operated on Bobby Orr and many other people after that, but he did save the fire chief's life ultimately. But meanwhile, back in the event, the kids were just going. People were everywhere. The local citizens were deputized and trying to help out the RCMP, who had then arrived from Grand Falls, and others had arrived then from Corner Brook. It was a wild scene. And around 10:30 or so, the fire had been put out. Dr. Toomey had been absolutely engaged in all this. Fellows had gone racing up Wireless Road collecting guns to deliver back to the cafe, because the police had no guns. They did not carry guns in that situation. They had to go back to their headquarters and unlock these little think of it as a post office box, you know, and that's where the gun was kept. And only you could go and get your gun. You couldn't say, I'm going to get my gun, I'll get yours too. No, you had to get your gun, come back, and then the other person had to go and get theirs. What a nightmare to be in, eh? And so when it was all over and everybody was shaking their heads, in the span of 24 hours, we had 3 deaths on our hands. We had a fire chief airlifted out to St. John's. We had a cafe that had been part of the infrastructure and a go-to place that had been burned and to the point where it would never be used again. Terry Hoy was now being sent to Peterborough. He was on the way to Peterborough. He would be buried on November the 11th, Remembrance Day. We were left with a hole in the ground where the cafe once stood. We had nobody to bury. All the bodies were either in Peterborough or out in St. John's being autopsied to find out just how they died. And the bodies never did come back to Botwood. Nobody could figure out where did they get buried. It was like it was a communication shutdown. And so we had that to deal with. And typically in cases of this type of thing, people find a church to gather, to collectively come together and pray and to collect your thoughts. And what church are you going to go to? You know, I mean, there's no bodies to bring anywhere. There, you know.
So it was a community.
It was a community event, but nowhere to go.
Yeah, and a community that was in shock, no doubt.
Absolutely.
I mean, the details in your book, and it's even hard to recreate and describe it because it's in such detail. You get into the Chinese community, how they came to Canada, what were the challenges, how that impacted these people, how they integrated. I mean, it's a fascinating read. But how did you get it all together? How did you sort it out? This is many years later. I know you were there, but you still had to.
Well, over time, I'm not the only one that wondered about it. I tell you, there were many people who wondered about it, and then they would speculate, and they would run with an assumption, and then all this folklore would gather around that, and oftentimes it was totally off the mark altogether. I would hear people accused of being responsible for this thing happened, and Jim was a cruel person, and so on. Ken was a nutcase, and things like that. These are words that would have been going around, but I could not understand that. You know, there didn't seem to be any sense to be made of it all. Nobody could understand the Chinese were so they were so private in their thinking and so on. So I set out to find out what was going on, and I went to many sources, and I interviewed people, some of which were 92 years old when I interviewed them. 92 with minds as sharp as a tack. Took me right inside the cafe, taught me all about a 10-cent Coke and a 50-cent Coke, and the second layer of business that was going on inside that cafe. It was absolutely revealing to me what was going on. The more I dug into it, and the Chinese reached out to me because they knew I was sincere in trying to get to the bottom of what happened, because the Chinese didn't know either. The RCMP didn't know. Nobody knew. And ultimately there was a magisterial inquiry called, and it was carried out right here in Grand Falls by Mr. Magistrate Cran. And it was interesting. Nobody could find that could find the inquiry. We knew it was held, and I knew when it was completed, but it had disappeared. And years and years and years had gone by, and finally I said, I'm going to find it. I promised Bill Butler. He was a man who went up Wireless Road looking for guns to get from his hunting friends to give to the RCMP because they were in mortal danger. And I told him, I said, we got to find out what was going on. And so suddenly, after much stress and strain on my part, I get a call saying, we have found it. It does indeed exist. And it took them 3 weeks to get it together for me. And that was 850 pages. That, along with another 800 or 900 pages from Ottawa, and many, many other hundreds of pages of data and signed documents and so on I found, I start putting all this together and chasing down the people who were mentioned, and I conducted many interviews with these people, and I had papers spread out all over this huge...
Did you have like a storyboard, or how did you keep track?
Well, I had this large dining room table, and I would be writing, and this page suddenly that ties in with page over here, and this took me forever because it seemed to be little discrepancies between one thing and another. So I would chase it down, and finally, I found some wonderful people. I found one of the ladies who was integral to this story, and her name was Linda Canning, and I found her, and she was very, very shocked that anybody would go after this story. I sat with her for 4.5, 5 hours. I ate every cookie she had in her house. I was starved, didn't stop long enough to eat. And she told me what happened.
Well, she was there that night.
She was standing at the foot of the ladder when the 2 RCMP officers had gone up the ladder to go in. This would have been about 5 minutes to midnight. And Terry was about to climb up the ladder, and he looked down and he saw her in all this terrible rain and sleet and stuff. He said, "My dear," he said, you're shivering, you're cold." So he stepped off the ladder, took off his PEA jacket, and he wrapped it around her and from behind and said, "No," I said, "hold that right there. I'll be back in a few minutes." And he scampered up over the stairs.
And was never back.
Never back again. And so all these things were very touching. I've had people take time out and talk with me about because I asked people, how do you remember what happened? It wasn't like, how do you remember compared to how so-and-so remembers, because one of you have got to be wrong if you don't agree. It wasn't that approach. Everybody's recollections were what they recollected, and I wanted to document that so that people's stories, as they remembered them, were told. Right? And then people, the reader, then could ascertain, once they weighed the facts and so on, they could formulate their own opinion. Things that were really strange were like, at the end of this fire, suddenly the people go into the upstairs cafe, and Mr. Ling is on the Chesterfield, and is warm, and he was a big man, so he was kind of like jiggly a little bit, with like jelly. That's a terrible thing to say, but not very kind. But still, if he was a big man. And so he could be warm and movable, while Ken, the son, was on his back, cold as ice, and his hands up like that in a rigid position. People believed right away that Jim had killed Ken. And he had been dead for some time. It could only be that.
That's what you would think.
That would be right. And so everybody was waiting for the autopsy report to come out from Dr. Josephson. Well, it never came out. It was never released, not to the public. It was never released, so nobody knew. So the speculation went on, and Jim was demonized, and Ken was demonized, and Hersey Canning was demonized if she hadn't gone to the police, and so on and so forth. And so all this stuff was going on. In the meantime, what we did not know, and what I learned, was the degree of racism that permeated Newfoundland at that time. I'm not talking about Joe and Harry at the bar, that kind of thing. I'm talking about the legislation that existed in Newfoundland was brutal at that time, and it was merely a carryover from what was going on in Canada and what was going on in the United States. See, the Chinese came over here first of all, came over to North America.
For a better life.
Chasing Gold Mountain. They called it Gold Mountain because they were chasing the Klondike. And all of a sudden the Klondike petered out. And so now all of a sudden now the federal government, the Canadian, we weren't Canada then, the Canadian government had all these Chinese around. And what are you going to do with them? Well, at that time, they were trying to connect Prince Edward Island out to the west coast, to British Columbia. So they had several provinces already part of Canada. they approached BC and said, join Canada, and we'll do this and that and the other thing. So the BC people said, are you kidding? Have you noticed the wall between BC and the rest of Canada? That's Rocky Mountains. Why don't we just go on down the western seaboard, down around El Paso and so on? We got our Pacific markets and so on and so forth. Canada steps up and says, here's what we'll do. We'll build a railway right from Montreal and we'll put it right down downtown Vancouver and we'll pay for it. How do you think of that? What do you think of that? Canada says, BC people said, we'll sign on. And they did. And so that meant tens of thousands of Chinese were now needed because we had no labor. That brought them in. Now, the minute that the labor movement was, the minute that the spike was driven,
Right.
now we had Chinese that we didn't need anymore. Now they wanted them out of there. So now that we've used you for cheap labor, we don't need you anymore. So we're going to start charging you head taxes, and so on and so forth. So all this racism started to creep in. And so this is why when Jim Ling he came over and he left his home province and he landed in Vancouver, he was placed in a car with a guard on each side of the car.
Yeah, that's in your book. He
But
couldn't.
so all this racism stuff, they were living with it, but we didn't understand it. How could we understand? We didn't know. And so Jim and Wong, young Wong, and William Fong, and Charlie and all these people, they had gone through that, but we didn't know that. All they wanted was to be in the land of opportunity. And so they were dealing with the crisis as it unfolded with that backdrop of their Confucius beliefs and the racism to which they were subjected. And we were trying to sort it all out with trying to imagine what would have been in a magisterial inquiry had it been released. So everybody was trying to get to the bottom of it, and nobody could.
And nobody could, but you did. You got the copy of that through your
yeah.
work. So there's a lot that you've gathered and put into this book, and you alluded to it taking time. How long did it take to write the book?
I would say when I really set my mind to it, it took me about 3.5 years. I really started gathering the first thing probably about 10 or 11, 12 years before, when I brought it up in a conversation, and somebody said, if you're going to start looking for this book and doing a book at some point in time, go over to Elmo Waterman's over on Park Avenue, and because Leo Dominic took a picture years ago. Well, this is the very picture that Leo Dominic took. I had a copy that I got a copy from Elmo Waterman, eventually a fire chief. And that was the start. That was the very first thing that I got, and the rest of it, I started doing private interviews, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, a lot. And so the interviews you did one-on-one. What type did you record them, or did you take notes? How did you handle
Some
that?
Some I recorded, made people aware that they were being recorded because I said, this is your story. I want it to be accurate.
Right.
Right. And others I just made notes. And there were times when the Chinese invited me into their homes. If you can believe that, the Chinese, and not only did they invite me into their homes, they said, I think we have pictures of Jim Ling and Harry Chow. And they brought it to me. They came to me, and because they knew that I was trying to do the right thing, which was get to the bottom of what happened.
And tell us.
It was a very heartwarming thing. They invited me out to their flower service. The Chinese have a flower service once a year. It's the Sunday following Regatta Day, and all the Chinese pour into St. John's, and they have rituals that they go through and prayers and so on. They invited me, a Caucasian. They invited me to partake because they knew that I was trying to do the right thing. So I was very, very fortunate that they saw it that way. Quite
an honor. And you know you're not going to believe this, Fred, but I mean, we're soon going to be out of time on this topic, and I think we have, it's like the tip of the iceberg. I think you've certainly intrigued people about this story and what you've written. They can read that. And it ended up at Flanker Press very, very quickly. How did it come to be published with Flanker Press?
Well, with Flanker Press, I knew I knew the owner, publisher of Flanker Press, Gary and Margot Cranford, through a friendship of mine with a fellow named Len Power. And I happened to be in Grand Falls one day at the mall, and I noticed Gary was bringing some equipment down from upstairs. And I said, "Why don't we grab a cup of coffee and we'll have a chat about it?" And I gave him a very brief overview. He said, "I can't believe what you're telling me. I think that would be a good book to write. Maybe you should consider writing a book about this, Fred." And you know, Flanker would certainly look at it, and they did. And so I cast a wide net, pulled it all in, whatever was in that net. I took it. I didn't know how to write, but I gathered all the facts, and then we engaged a lady, Donna Morrissey, who many people would recognize, and she looked at it and she saw all this massive
the joy of being an editor.
She said, "You got to get this out. This doesn't belong. The story's about Jim Ling and the things that happened to Jim." And she said, "And by the way," she says, "what are you doing in the book? Get out of the book. I keep tripping up in you and wondering what you're doing in the book. Get out, take yourself out of the book, and you tell the story. Don't be in the story."
In the story.
So I really thanked her for that.
Well, that's a pretty good point to end this interview on. You very briefly mentioned in it as a young boy, but I just want to thank you so much for stopping by here and sharing this part. I'd like to have another chat with you even in more detail about how all this came together, but people can get this in town. They can get it on Flanker Press site.
You sure can.
And you're one of our local heroes now.
Oh,
Thank you so much, Fred, for coming by.
Appreciate you having me.
Thank you, and maybe more books will come.
Okay.
Thank you.